Welcome to Ledarsidorna.se. Today we are talking about the situation in Israel. And as a guest we have Shaun from the NGO Monitor. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Swedish role in the two-state solution and what Swedish aid money and aid funding is really doing for work. Welcome, Shaun. Well, you come from the organization and the NGO Monitor, based in Jerusalem.
Yes.
A little bit healthier climate, temperature-wise, than Stockholm this time of the year, but nevertheless, can you explain a little bit what you are doing on the NGO Monitor? What's your mandate, actually?
Well, our organization was established around 15 years ago, with the idea of looking into the activities, funding and influence of non-governmental organizations. We started soon after the infamous Durban conference in 2001, which was supposed to be a UN conference on racism and xenophobia, and the reality was it became a UN conference that bashed Israel and in some cases even crossed the line into blatant anti-Semitism. And our current president, Professor Steinberg, started looking into the non-governmental organizations that were instrumental in some of this anti-Israel and in some cases anti-Semitic hostility. And this is now developed into our organization 15 years later, and we find that many of these non-governmental organizations are actually government funded, and they're heavily involved in anti-Israel propaganda, in using human rights as a cover for major political activities that contradict the real values of human rights.
Yes, when we talked about this, you're explaining a little bit more than how does these government-funded NGOs, actually funded by Swedish tax money, how they can you give us some example on how they contradict a two-state solution?
Well, an example is Sweden gives nearly $5.7 million to a fund called the Human Rights and International Law Secretariat. This fund gives money to 24 different NGOs, and when we look down the list of these NGOs, we find some very troubling activity. For example, one of the recipients, an organization called Badil, gets significant funding from this Swedish fund, nearly $400,000, and they openly call for the return of refugees and a de-Zionized one state of Palestine. So we have a situation, an absurd situation, where the Swedish government openly says they support a negotiated two-state solution, yet Swedish taxpayer money, a large amount of Swedish taxpayer money, is going to directly fund the core activities of an organization that works against a negotiated two-state solution.
That's quite serious. And so have you some kind of, you mentioned for me the BDS organization. Can you explain a little bit more?
Here again, we have, almost as a result of the Durban conference, in 2005, a number of Palestinian organizations began to call for the boycott, divestment and sanctions of Israel. And many people refer to this as the Palestinian NGO call for BDS. But when we look at these NGOs that made this call, the overwhelming majority of them are actually European-funded Palestinian NGOs. So at its very core, the BDS program against Israel is European-funded. And as I said before, we look at this pool of Swedish funding. 24 NGOs receive funding, 15 of them, who receive the majority of funding, openly support BDS. Many of them were the signatories on the original call for BDS, others joined later, but we have an absurd situation where millions of Swedish crowns are going to support the activities of organizations that promote BDS, not only in their own country, but here in Sweden and in the European Union and around the world. Sweden is directly paying for the boycott, divestments and sanctions of Israel internationally.
One of the organizations we talked about was the Islamic Relief Organization, which is linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's legal in Sweden but illegal in Israel.
Yes. So Islamic Relief receives about $3.5 million according to CEDA's own website. In Israel, the Muslim Brotherhood was banned by the previous Minister of Defense. The claim was that Islamic Relief Worldwide was part of a funding mechanism to Hamas. At the same time, Islamic Relief in the UK ran an internal audit, and they found themselves clear. Soon after that, a number of moderate Arab states banned Islamic Relief Worldwide, and HSBC Bank in the UK also closed a number of Islamic Relief Worldwide accounts. Yet, CEDA continues to fund Islamic Relief Worldwide.
That's quite some news for the Swedish audience. And we talked a little bit how these organizations, how these NGOs, they're actually using the legal systems to harass Israeli citizens and officials. You mentioned to me one official going to Belgium.
So it's a tactic that we call lawfare. The idea being that many of these NGOs, many of these Swedish-funded and European-funded NGOs, are now attempting to pervert the legal and justice systems of Israel and of the rest of the world to politicize them against Israel. For example, we recently had a case where former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Tzipi Livni, had to cancel a trip to Belgium because Swedish-funded NGOs were attempting to have her arrested in Belgium. And we've had similar cases in the UK where Israeli officials have been threatened with arrest. And this is now going to a further level where many of these Swedish-funded organizations are collaborating to try Israelis at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And the ramifications for this are also significant for Sweden. It may right now only seem that these organizations are targeting Israel, but many of the allegations are bogus and highly problematic. And we only saw recently, only a few months ago, the United Kingdom released a document where they showed there were thousands of bogus attempts to try UK soldiers for events that happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. But the precedent had already been set with Israel. So if we set a precedent with Israel, that Israeli soldiers are involved in legitimate operations where there's an unfortunate case where there are civilian casualties, not necessarily as a result of Israeli actions. The same thing happened in the UK where there were civilian deaths not as a result of UK actions, but because of the combat zone. We are now in a situation where Sweden is rightly expanding its armed forces, and Swedish peacekeepers may unfortunately be involved in situations around the world where civilian casualties may happen, even if it is not as a direct result of Swedish armed forces. But once a precedent was set with Israel, how long before Swedish soldiers who are bravely defending the rights and regulations of Sweden or on peacekeeping missions are being dragged before the International Criminal Court on trumped-up charges because Sweden-funded organizations that set a precedent by making Israel an example. So I know it's a little long-winded, but I hope it can be seen how very soon Sweden may be funding the demise of its own armed forces.
We are actually in sort of that friction area in Mali, the conflict zone in Mali. We are in a UN mission, and on the other side we have organizations linked to the ICWAN, to the Muslim Brotherhood. That's Akim, that's Boko Haram, and other organizations that, you know, well,
yes,
they are linked. So sort of we are funding the one part and fighting it as well at the same time. So we're going into,
again, I don't want to get into necessarily funding organizations like that. What I'm most concerned about is from an Israeli point of view, where we have Swedish taxpayers that are funding organizations that are attempting to subjugate the Israeli Defense Forces and using legality as a cover for political aims. And the same thing is bound to happen to Swedish armed forces who are on legitimate peacekeeping missions, but they may find themselves dragged before The Hague with organizations that are using Swedish money to subvert justice.
Yes, okay, I understand. And all this, cover up that you put a name on a lawfare, and it's actually hiding anti-Semitism. So,
anti-Semitism is also a major issue, and I think the question needs to be, how do we define anti-Semitism? The UK the United Kingdom was the very first government to actually say that there is certain criticism of Israel that's legitimate, but once you start making Nazi comparisons between Israelis and you take the criticism of Israel to a very horrendous level, that already becomes anti-Semitism. When you hold Israel to a double standard, when you demonize Israel and Israeli officials, that is already well beyond legitimate criticism. And we find many Swedish NGOs are quite happy to accept Swedish money and use Nazi analogies to Israel, hold Israel to a complete double standard, and demonize Israel and Israeli officials to a terrible degree. And this is all being done with the blessing and money of Sweden. And then we have another strange example where these same NGOs that are blatantly hostile to the State of Israel completely contradict Swedish policy that wants a negotiated two-state solution, and in some cases may cross the line into blatant anti-Semitism. The reports of these organizations are used by the Swedish Foreign Ministry to help create Swedish policy.
So the solution is then that what you're asking for, actually, or what you would like to see, if I understand it, that Sweden really makes an audit on what are we supporting.
I think an independent audit is vital, but independent needs to be done by individuals and organizations that have no connection politically or otherwise to NGOs in the region. Unfortunately, that is very difficult to do, and CEDA recently ran an evaluation that was actually run by somebody who was well connected to the NGO world in Israel, and the result being that they found that CEDA funding was fantastic and CEDA funding increased. There needs to be a real independent audit. More than that, organizations that are found to contradict Swedish principles and Swedish values, they should not be getting money under any circumstances. Organizations that support BDS should not be receiving Swedish funding under any circumstances. And most importantly, organizations that are involved in anti-Semitism or terror should have their funding suspended immediately. That is the duty of the Swedish electorate, at the very least, is their duty to Swedish taxpayers.
So just to round up, do you see any international actor, from your point of view, that could perform such an audit?
Well, Sweden, we'll have to see. But at the very least, like I said, the UK has already adopted a very strict definition of anti-Semitism. The Dutch government has passed a non-binding resolution to suspend funding to organizations that support BDS and anti-Semitism. The Swiss government recently passed a resolution to suspend funding to organizations that support BDS and anti-Semitism. This is being done by other governments and is becoming more and more effective. In fact, the European Union recently published new guidelines where they actually said that organizations that support BDS can't have certain projects funded by the European Union. So there is progress. And I think it is important that Sweden follows the trend of making progress to be accountable for its money.
And in that case, if we succeed, maybe we can play a role for the two-state solution.
Well, I think it's vital not only to play a role, is Sweden is no longer seen as a neutral actor. And this could be a reason. Sweden is openly funding organizations that contradict what the Swedish foreign policy is saying. Sweden is openly funding and supporting organizations that are hostile to the State of Israel. Sweden is funding organizations that support BDS. And when the Israeli public sees what the Swedish government is doing, it's no longer seen as a neutral actor. In fact, it's seen as a very hostile actor. And that's a tragedy, because Sweden historically should play a role of a mediator, but that's not the case.
It's too bad. With our history, actually, with the white buses during the Second World War.
Absolutely. As I said, it's tragic. Even when you go back to the white bus issue and others, and many other examples where not only in our region but around the world, Sweden should play the role of a neutral moderator that can get to a peaceful solution for all sides involved. But when it comes to our region, to the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's not only not seen as a neutral operator, it's seen as hostile to one side. So all its activities and efforts are for naught.
Okay, thank you, Shaun. And maybe this is one of the steps we have to take to talk a little bit more with the Swedish taxpayers what we are really up to in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great to talk to you.